As Mina said, my name is Mandy Michael, and I am from Australia. And when everybody thinks of Australia, they always think of Sydney, Sydney Opera House, Sydney Harbour Bridge. I'm not from Sydney. As Mina said, I'm from Perth, which is all the way over the other side of the country. For context, it's about 5 to 6 hours on a plane from Perth to Sydney. And there's two things about Perth that make it really, really amazing. The first thing is that that's where my dog lives. His name is Jello, and that's his Instagram account, and you should follow him. Mandy is my Instagram account, if you're into Instagram. I don't really post on it, it's not that interesting. The second thing about Perth that's really, really amazing, and it's very unique to Perth, is that we have this island off the coast called Rottnest, and on Rottnest are these super cute animals called a quokka. This Twitter account tweets a picture of a quokka every hour. It's built by one of my colleagues. They're known as the happiest animal in the world, and you can have selfies with them and stuff. Chris Hemsworth was just there, with Matt Damon getting like their quokka selfies, so definitely come visit me in Perth and I'll take you to see the quokkas. The ulterior motive for me showing you this and my pictures of my dog is that I'm hoping it puts you in a really good mood post-lunch and that you are open to listening to me talk about variable fonts, specifically the performance benefits of variable fonts. So what I'll do is I'll quickly explain what they are, how we use them, and then I'll run you through the performance pros and cons, because unfortunately there are some cons to variable fonts from a performance perspective. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end for me to show you some fun stuff. But first, I wanted to explain how I came to learn about variable fonts. Currently, I build a React website, so I write JavaScript all the time. But my passion is CSS, and I love designing things and playing with things and trying to push the boundaries of what people think we can do with CSS on the web. So what I do is I like to tinker. And for the past couple of years, I've been creating a bunch of text effects like this. I don't know if you can see them very well. And it's all like CSS and HTML and fonts. Because I use a lot of fonts, I kind of came across variable fonts and thought, oh, I should see what these things do. And it became really clear to me that they offer a lot of opportunities that standard fonts just can't really provide us. So the reason that I wanted to mention this is when we talk about variable fonts, people often become interested in them because of the performance benefits that are apparently there for variable fonts. But for me, it was all about the creativity side of things. And I think this is important to understand because we kind of often think design and performance are separate things and you can't have both. I think that's wrong. I think you can have both, and I also think that variable fonts are a really good demonstration of why you can have both. So another thing I wanted to get out of the way is browser support because I don't want you thinking about it during the presentation. It's pretty good. All the major browsers support it. IE is never going to support it because they don't do that anymore. And some of the default Android browsers don't support it either. The only thing that you have to keep in mind with the latest modern browsers is that you need to have High Sierra on Mac, for example, in order for them to render. That is not the case for Chrome, though. They have their own rendering thing for the fonts, so it's really only for Firefox and things like that that you need to have the latest operating system. So, with that in mind, let's talk about what variable fonts actually are. And this is really important for context because if I don't explain this to you later, you're going to be confused. So the best way to describe what a variable font is that it's one font file that acts like multiple fonts. So where you might have previously had 6 different font styles, all as separate individual files, variable fonts can have all this information in only one file. And the way this is achieved is down to how the fonts themselves are created. So variable fonts, they can contain one or more axes that provide different variations between different extremes. So as an example, you might have a lightweight font and a heavy font, so like 200 to 900. And along that axis, a variable font value can be interpolated. So that allows for a bunch of intermediate designs that we've previously not had before with the standard font weights. And that gives us a lot finer control over the different variations. So rather than just having the standard weights like 200, 400, 700, 900, we can have all of the values in between those numbers. So you can have 201, 202, 637, and so on and so forth. And that can even include decimal places as well. Now, because of the interpolation, because all that stuff is calculated, it tends to mean that typically the font files of a variable font are much smaller than if you were to combine all of the standard fonts together. And because the axis is interpolated, it means that we can animate between the values, creating really smooth transitions, which is something that we've not been able to do with standard fonts before. But what is even better about variable fonts is that we're not just limited to a single axis at a time. A variable font can contain thousands of axes, and as you can see in this image, the interpolation doesn't just apply to one axis, it applies to the combinations as well. So the more axes that are in your font, the more combinations and the more variations you have. So in this case, if you wanted a wider lightweight, that's fine. If you want a heavier condensed style, that's not a problem, and you can pick something anywhere in between that as well. All those styles can exist within the one file. So essentially, a variable font gives us a single file with a greater amount of variation, resulting in a significant increase in choice in how we represent our fonts on the web. And it doesn't just have to be standard things like bold and width. It could be something completely different as well, like Decovar, which is a little bit weird. It's my favorite variable font to experiment with. It's actually an experimental variable font. It's by David Berlow, and it's got heaps of really fun effects and things that you can play with, heaps more than I'm showing here. And I just think it's pretty awesome. I'll show you some cool examples of this one later. Now, one of the things that people ask me a lot when they want to start playing with variable fonts is if you have to do something special in order to use them, because, you know, it's got all the interpolation and all that kind of stuff. But the way that we use variable fonts is really, really similar to how we would normally use fonts on the web. For the most part, we set them up exactly the same as we do now, so using font face. The main change is how we define variations for descriptors like font weight, font stretch, and font style. So in this example, we might have previously set a font weight of 200, and that would be our light font, and then we would set another font face block, and that would be our bold font. We don't need to do this with a variable font. Instead, we can just set a range. So here I've set a range of 200 to 700. And then when we go to reference the font in our CSS, the same way that we normally would, we can pick any number between 200 and 700, and that will be the weight that our font uses. So this is really, really good for things like weight, because we already have a CSS property for that. In the variable fonts world, I guess, this is known as a registered axis, which basically means it's a common axis that the spec authors felt should be standardized. There are 5 of them at the moment. It's weight, width, italic, slant, and optical sizing. And they're all mapped to pre-existing CSS properties, which are font weight, font stretch, font style is for slant and italic, and then font optical size for optical sizing. So in order to do something custom, like the Decovar ones that I showed you, we need a new CSS property. And that's called font variation settings, and it enables us to define as many custom axes and registered axes as we need. So in this example, I've defined 2 axes. They're each represented by a 4-character string or code, and then an associated number value. And for every axis that you want to define, you separate it by a comma. In this example, the string WGHT refers to the registered axis of weight, and weight is always referenced this way. And then INLI, that refers to a custom axis called inline. Registered axes are defined by spec. Custom axis codes are determined by whoever makes the font, and they decide that when they make it. What's really, really important to remember is that you should not use registered axes in font variation settings if you don't have to. They're not really intended to be used in font variation settings, and you should always use the mapped CSS property if you can. So, we know what browsers they work in, we know how to use them. What I want to talk about now is the thing that you all care about, which is the performance benefits, maybe or not. And normally, when we think about web fonts and their impact on performance, we'd focus on 3 areas: the number of requests, the font file size, and the time to first render. And if you know much about web font performance, some of these things are going to be known to you, but what I will do is talk to you about how variable fonts relate specifically in those cases. So the first one is reducing the number of requests. Now you can do this a number of ways. CDNs and caching are obviously one of them, but I'm not going to go into that because other people have done that way better than I ever could. And they're kind of the same for variable fonts that it is for standard fonts. But from a variable font perspective, a way that we would reduce the number of styles is by having less font files. So that's how, from a standard font perspective, we'd get rid of the number of requests, just have less variation. So this would mean that we'd have to plan our typography choices and weigh up the cost of design over the cost of performance, and then we'd have to justify that cost before adding any more. But with a variable font, it can contain multiple variations in the one file. So this means we've immediately reduced the number of requests without having to really question the amount of choice that we've got in our designs. But the problem with this is that if all of that data and information is in one file, what does it do to the font file size itself? So this brings me to the next thing, which is reducing the font file sizes. Now what I want to do is set a bit of a baseline and compare a single standard weight to a variable font, and then we'll go through and see what the compression is with efficient formats like WOF2. So I'm going to start with an OTF file because they're really, really big. So, you know, it's a good starting point, bit of a baseline. I'm using Source Sans Pro, which is available on GitHub. You have a variable font version of it. A single weight is approximately 243 kilobytes as an OTF file. And the variable font is 405 kilobytes, which is about 73% larger. So it's a much bigger file. But because the variable font contains all of that information, it seems fair to compare that to the total combined size of all of the different Source Sans Pro weights. So I think there's 5 there. It comes to about 1,170 kilobytes, approximately, which then makes the variable font 65% less than the total combined file size. But what's even more interesting about this is if you wanted to use only 2 of these weights, because you know we don't use that many font weights in our projects at the moment. If you just wanted bold and regular, which is pretty common, I work on a news site, so bold and regular is a thing that we do a lot. It's still smaller to use the variable font than it is to use 2 versions of the single font as an OTF file. So what about if we compress it to WOF2? I was a little bit surprised by these results. The WOF2 comes down to about 111 as a single weight, and the variable font came down to 112, which, considering the amount of options that I have in the variable font, that extra kilobyte seems like a pretty big win to me. In this case, I would absolutely go with the variable font. But what I should probably mention is that it's going to depend on the fonts that you use. You're not always going to get this good savings when you when you compress them using WOF2. It depends on how the fonts are made, it depends on how many fonts you want to use, how many variations you want to use. So you do still need to kind of test and make sure that you're actually getting the benefits that you want. One thing to note about Source Sans Pro is that it's a really, really comprehensive font. It contains a lot of different characters for different languages. So this brings me to the next thing we can do to reduce size, which is subsetting. Now we do this at the moment with our standard fonts to remove unnecessary characters. You might reduce it down to a specific language set, like Latin characters, for example. This comes with some risks, because you might find that if you've too heavily subset your font, parts of your text might render in your fallback instead of your custom font. But it is a really good way to reduce the size of the font itself. I use a tool called Glyphhanger by Filament Group. It's really straightforward to use. They've got great README files on their GitHub page. I wasn't actually sure that you could subset a variable font. I thought that maybe because of the interpolation and the way the files are made that it wouldn't really work that well. But it works. I ran the WAF2 through Glyphhanger. The single weight dropped down to 16 kilobytes, which is really nice. I subset to the Latin characters. The variable font came down to 27, so it's not quite as good as the single weight, but it's still pretty small, and it's still smaller than 2 versions of the standard font. But let's assume, you're maybe not going to subset as heavily as I did. The single variable font is still larger than using 1 weight. So there are some additional considerations to take into account here. With a standard font, because individually the files are smaller, you might have your body text render and then, so your regular text render, and then bold might come in, and so on and so forth until all of your fonts have loaded. And the benefit here is that you get your content sooner because you're not waiting for one single larger file to download before any text is rendered. So this can result in a longer delay before you see any content. And that can cause these kinds of problems. So with the standard fonts, because you get it in chunks, you could have a quote that's like, oh, there's no value in performant websites. And everyone's like, oh my God, what are you saying? That's crazy. And then your other bit of font comes in, and you're like, no, I said that they're supposed to be performant. But because you've got 2 separate files with 2 different styles, you can get it loading at different times. With a variable font, this won't happen because all the data is in the 1 file. It'll download at once, and then everything will render. The benefit of this is also that it won't cause the page to re-render every time, redraw every time you load in a new font, because you're not getting the layout shifting multiple times. It's only going to be once. So this brings me to the last thing about the performance, which is reducing the time to first render. In order for me to talk about this, I'm briefly going to mention the flash of unstyled text and flash of invisible text, and you're probably going to be like, what has this got to do with variable fonts? But I will get there, so just bear with me, much like my dog is doing with that biscuit that I wouldn't let him eat. So the flash of invisible text, for those that don't know, is when we block or delay the font from loading until it's available. And the flash of unstyled text is when we load a fallback and switch or swap to our custom font when they're ready. In my opinion, flash of unstyled text is a better experience than not being able to read content at all. You can argue with me about this later, but I think it's better. What we should really aim to do is embrace that and try to limit the impacts as much as we can. So the way that we go about doing this is we can use the font display property with the value of swap. There are other options you can use, but I like swap. And what that does is it renders our fallback font that's defined in our font stack pretty fast, and then it'll swap the custom font in when it loads. It kind of looks a little bit awkward like this. Cool. I actually can't see it animate on screen, so I didn't know when it was going to finish. That's my dog being really awkward, because that's what that felt like. So, much like that awkward Jello example and my awkward presenting, when you swap between the fallback and the custom fonts, we can often see effects where the layout is kind of shifting between the different sizes of the fonts. Now, Monica, who I'm sure everyone has heard of because she's amazing, made this really great font style matcher that lets you modify line height and size and letter spacing to try and match our fonts, our system fonts to our custom fonts to try and reduce that layout shifting. So it doesn't kind of move as much as the previous example. So how this ties into variable fonts, it's not really a thing, but I like to mention it because I kind of want everyone to encourage it to become a thing. What I'm hoping is that as variable fonts become more widely supported across operating systems, we can reduce the layout shifting by using a variable font as our system font, as our fallback in our font stack. So this would be really, really amazing, because if you imagine for a moment we had system fonts with control over weight, width, and optical size, we'd be able to control the font itself. So we could match the size and the width more closely with our custom fonts. It obviously wouldn't look the same, but by combining it with the line height and the font size techniques, we'd be able to create a really, really smooth transition between the two fonts, and we wouldn't get as much redraw, and that flash of unstyled text would be reduced because everything is sized to match the custom font that we want to load in. So you get the benefit of your text loading really quickly with a fallback, but then you can load in your custom font without things like janking all over the page. So variable fonts will, as a TLDR, reduce the overall combined file size if you're loading in a lot of different styles. You only have one network request for the weights. And even though it's slightly bigger, if you combine that with improved font compression formats like WOF2, if you subset your font where possible, and you use font loading techniques like font display swap and Monica's font style matcher, we can end up in a situation where the performance of our font rendering is improved, much like we do now, but you get a significant increase in design opportunity and typography. And if we're able to solve some of those problems and use variable fonts, we can start to shift our focus, and we no longer need to trade off design for performance. We can have both. Creativity can drive our choices instead of technical limitations. And we can be less concerned about all of the previous limitations that we've had. I mean, obviously, if you want to load 12 variable fonts in your site, that's going to be a bad time. So you still have to be responsible. But variable fonts do give us an opportunity to figure out how we can use the technology to create better experiences for our users. This is Jello Ipsum, which I will eventually give to all of you to use instead of Lorem Ipsum, which isn't as fun. So because variable fonts offer so much variation, it means we can create experiences which better suit our devices, our environments, and adjust our fonts to create more accessible and legible text. This is a really great example that I really like, because we're able to recognize the environments our users are in. We've got the sensor APIs, the CSS4-5 media queries. We can detect different things about their environments and their devices and change the way our fonts are being rendered to better suit that experience. We can create more sufficient contrast, or this. My phone is cracked. I don't know if you can see that. It's always cracked. I'm perpetually dropping my phone, and I thought this was appropriate. The increase in flexibility that we get from variable fonts means that we have a lot more design opportunity, and designs which would have previously been a really heavy burden on performance or impossible due to technical limitations are possible now. This is on CodePen. It has 11 different weights, 2 variable fonts. That is the OTF file size, so the WOF2 font size is a lot smaller, but all of the weights that I'm using in here don't exist in the font, except in the variable font. And it really changes the meaning of the content that you're trying to present. And that is something that we've missed out on the web for a really long time. And I literally put this slide in so I could put pictures of my dog everywhere. It's a really terrible design, but he's so cute. We can embrace the learnings of print, that, you know, hundreds of years of print design and theory is lost on the web at the moment. And variable fonts combined with things like CSS Grid are going to enable us to do things that we haven't been able to do before, but also to benefit from the flexibility and interactive nature of the web. Now this last point I'm going to make is like, maybe, I don't want to say it is a thing, and I don't want to say it isn't, but it's a consideration. Because variable fonts allow us to animate things and allow us to change and control fonts in ways that we've never been able to do them before, you can create some really interesting effects with variable fonts and CSS that don't require complex JavaScript animation libraries or things like that, no canvas or anything. The caveat here is that if the font itself is a really large file, an SVG and a little bit of CSS might be a better option for you, so you do need to like balance that out. But if you're subsetting and you're using good compression formats, you might find that the variable font is better. So this is an example that I made with Decovar, my favorite variable font, and it's just CSS and Decovar. It uses a CSS animation, and you can edit the text. It's selectable, you can search it, it can be read by a screen reader. And this is something that we've not been able to do with standard fonts before. We'd need SVG or Canvas or something like that. This one allows you to write the text out, which is really amazing. Just a bit of CSS with a font. Or this one, which is my favorite. The code pen for this that I have hooks into dark mode on the Mac. So when you put dark mode on, it oozes because it's dark mode. Yeah? I'm glad you laughed and got it, because I showed this to someone before and I said that and they were like, huh? I'm like, oh man, come on. It's really, I love that one. I'm going to end on a bit of a bummer with a huge performance caveat that kind of ruins this for me, which I thought was a bold move, but you can't really see it. That's such a shame. I'll have to tweet it out because this is the coolest demo that I have. Animating variable fonts, particularly in Chrome, is a bit shit right now. Especially this example, because it's got a really long text shadow, and as the font is animated, the text shadow disappears with it, so it's incredible and amazing, but Chrome, I guess, gets really excited by it, and the fan goes nuts, and if you have it open in multiple tabs, it absolutely is going to crash your browser. So they've still got some work to do on how the fonts are rendered, and when you animate them, I think what they told me they were doing is they were re-rendering it every time it was being animated. Don't quote me on that, but moral of this story is they're still fairly new in browsers and they've got a bit of work to do. So I guess to finish up, what I want to say is that, in my opinion, we are in a really good time to be designing and developing for the web, and from a design perspective as well. This is an amazing time for us with Grid and variable fonts and all of the amazing things we can do to improve our performance and create incredibly designed websites as well. And I think that's really exciting. And variable fonts, they can potentially really improve the performance of your site, but at the same time, you can benefit from the greater design opportunity and create more accessible and meaningful content. And that is what I think is really important about everything that we do, that the content is meaningful, that it's accessible, and that it's performant, and that everyone can access it as quickly as possible. Here are a bunch of resources which I will share out later, so don't worry if you miss them. That first one, I should mention, the blog post by Helen Holmes called Type Is Your Right, is an incredible blog post, and you should all go and read it because it's really, really good. Thanks very much. Here's a quokka.